Many of you might be aware that the state flag of Hawaii contains the British Union flag, also known as the Union Jack, which is pretty strange, as Hawaii, as you may also be aware, was never part of the British Empire. Well, that's not entirely true, because what few people realise is that the British did actually end up ruling the island for 5 months in the 1840s. Not by some grand design in London, but thanks to the private land dealings of a local British diplomat and a Royal Navy officer who decided to act way beyond his brief. This is the story of the Paulet Affair in 1843, when Hawaii, for a fleeting moment in history, became part of the British Empire by mistake. The first British to visit the Hawaiian Islands were Captain James Cook and his crew in 1778. Also known to the British as the Sandwich Islands, after the sponsor of Captain Cook's Pacific expeditions, the Earl of Sandwich, it was in Hawaii that Cook met his death in 1779 when attacked by local inhabitants. Further British contact came in the 1790s when a former officer on Cook's ship, George Vancouver, visited the islands and established a friendship with the powerful king, Kamehameha I. It was Kamehameha who would, through warfare and diplomacy, unite the islands into a single kingdom under his rule in 1795. Vancouver presented the king with the red ensign of the Royal Navy as a sign of goodwill. He even offered British protection over the islands, which the king was seemingly interested in. However, the British government back in London was certainly not. Nevertheless, with French, Spanish, American and even Russian ships entering his waters, Kamehameha recognised the power of being seen to be aligned with the world's naval superpower at the time, and in 1816 incorporated the Union flag from that ensign into the first flag of Hawaii. Whilst in the early days the number and colour of the horizontal stripes of the flag changed, the Union flag, often called the Union Jack, was ever present. Relations with Britain were so cordial that Kamehameha's son, who had succeeded him shortly after the Napoleonic Wars, actually paid a state visit to London in 1824. Whilst there, both he and his wife contracted measles and died. A rather embarrassed British government decided to acknowledge the independent status of the Pacific Kingdom and the goodwill between the two countries by sending an official diplomatic representative, a consul, to the island. The man they sent would end up being central to that brief British occupation 20 years later. But more about him and that occupation shortly. For the next 20 years, Hawaii and their new young king, Kamehameha III, continued on its independent journey, but with a growing stream of foreigners visiting the islands. First came whaling fleets seeking provisions, but slowly they were replaced by those both wishing to trade with the islands and those, especially American vessels, using it as a port en route to China. Whilst the British had a historic interest in and good relations with Hawaii, they didn't actually have any specific interest in controlling the islands, nor did the French, who were more interested in Tahiti in the southern Pacific. The main outside interest and ultimately threat came from the Americans. Not only were the islands a useful stopping-off point en route to China, but there were a growing number of Americans who had longer-term, more permanent interests in Hawaii, in particular the growing number of sugar plantation owners and Protestant missionaries. These new visitors started to negotiate land deals with various senior Hawaiian leaders. And whilst the American sugar plantation owners and even some of the missionaries were doing land deals, it was the actions of Britain's diplomatic representative on the islands which would lead to that brief moment where Hawaii was claimed for the British Empire in the 1840s. Richard Charlton, the British consul to Hawaii, was born in Cornwall in 1791. Having worked for the East India Company, by the early 1820s he was independently trading with the Hawaiians, and it was his knowledge of the islands that resulted in his appointment as that British consul in 1824, whom I mentioned just now. After an 8-month journey, he arrived with his wife Betsy off Hawaii in April 1825 aboard HMS Blonde, a Royal Navy frigate commanded by the cousin of the poet Lord Byron. HMS Blonde also contained a sadder cargo, the bodies of the deceased King and Queen of Hawaii. and one of Charlton's first roles as British consul was to attend their state funeral. It was the first Christian, let alone Protestant, state funeral in the Pacific, which gives a fair indication of how successful those American missionaries had become in Hawaii. Over the next 20 years, Charlton was to regularly clash with those missionaries, none more so than Hiram Bingham I from the Congregational Church. The American evangelist, like most of his fellow missionaries, had very set views on Christianity. Fundamentally, it was Bingham's way or the highway. Even fellow Protestants, like Anglican Robert Charlton, were too liberal for him. Missionaries such as Bingham started to influence sections of Hawaiian society, most importantly, the leading sections of that society, with their strict Christian views. Another American missionary, the Reverend William Richards, had accused the British skipper of a whaling ship of human trafficking by buying a wife. It seems that the skipper had actually paid a dowry, but as far as the strict evangelical missionaries were concerned, that was as good as human trafficking, and the skipper found himself up in court. Through Charlton's efforts, he was finally acquitted. And if there was no room for this sort of soft Anglican Protestantism, the missionaries certainly had no time for Roman Catholics. In 1831, Catholic priests were expelled by the Hawaiian authorities at the insistence of Bingham, and this time Charlton's protests were ignored. The missionaries and their influence on the government were seen by Charlton as a threat to the interests of the more moderate Europeans, such as the British, who were present in Hawaii. And those interests were materially as well as diplomatically represented by Charlton. I guess once an East India Company man, always an East India Company man, because despite his diplomatic status, Charlton had set out to develop land interests in his own right. Of course, he wasn't the only one, but it seemed to Charlton that he was up against the missionaries. Not necessarily because they had any moral aversions to foreigners owning Hawaiian land, after all, many of them did, but because they seemed to prefer American foreigners owning whatever land was available, not least the sugar plantation owners. In 1840, Charlton formalised his claim for an area near Honolulu harbour and proceeded to construct a wharf. The Hawaiian authorities disputed his land claims, mainly on the grounds that they had been made in error, as those granting him land had not been in a legal position to do so. Charlton took his claims to a local court, but a jury, made up principally of American citizens, found against him. He was furious at what he saw as American missionary meddling and double standards. It really didn't help matters that the King's chief minister, a former American missionary by the name of Gerrit P. Judd, had somehow managed to purchase land for himself. Charlton now resolved to travel to London to present his case as British consul to the Foreign Office. In 1837, the French expelled Protestant missionaries in Tahiti, and Charlton decided to lobby the British government to send Royal Navy warships to do exactly the same to the American missionaries in Hawaii. But he also intended to push the British to go further and take outright control of the islands. They could then sort out the land disputes, which of course just happened to include his own rather valuable claims. Rattled and probably a tad irritated by the British consul's belligerent position, King Kamehameha III decided to send his own mission to London. In July 1843, before Charlton could leave, the King's private secretary was dispatched on the long journey, along with Reverend William Richards, the American missionary who'd accused the British skipper of human trafficking, to present the Hawaiian point of view. Caught out by the suddenness of the Hawaiian move, Charlton gave chase in September. Whilst desperately chasing the Hawaiian mission, Charlton arrived on the west coast of Mexico. There he met the captain of a warship from the Royal Navy's Pacific Fleet, by the name of Lord George Paulet. Born in 1803, Paulet was the son of the 13th Marquess of Winchester, and had joined the Royal Navy in 1817, just after the Napoleonic Wars. He served in the Portuguese Liberal Wars and the Spanish First Carlist War, before being appointed captain of the 26-gun frigate HMS Carrisfort in December 1841. Now, I've mentioned HMS Carrisfort in my recent episode about the Royal Navy bombardment of Acre in 1840. Check it out afterwards. Paulet sailed to join the Pacific Station under the command of Rear Admiral Richard Darton Thomas. and it was whilst serving off the west coast of Mexico in that squadron that Paulet met Richard Charlton en route to London. The British consul regaled him with tales that British subjects were being harassed and denied their legal rights in Hawaii. What he seems to have been a little coy about was that the main British citizen who was being denied their rights was probably Charlton himself. Concerned about what he'd heard, and also that a British diplomat was seemingly being treated with a lack of courtesy by the Hawaiian government, Paulet requested permission from Rear Admiral Thomas to investigate these claims. With his admiral's approval, he arrived at Honolulu on the 11th of February 1843 and demanded an audience with the king. The king, however, was visiting another island, and the British captain was told it would be 6 days before he'd be able to return. In the meantime, he was told he could deal with the chief minister, the American former missionary, Garrett P. Judd. The British officer refused to deal with the minister, not least because Paulet didn't really see him as an exactly neutral character in this whole drama. Instead, he issued an ultimatum on the 16th of February, demanding that in light of the continuing land ownership disputes, the king cede Hawaii to Queen Victoria. The following day, he informed the commander of a nearby US naval sloop, the USS Boston, that if the Hawaiians didn't comply with his ultimatum, he would attack Honolulu. Outgunned by HMS Carrisford and with no remit to support the Hawaiians, the captain of the Boston stood aside, although no attack on Honolulu actually took place. On the 18th of February 1843, Paulet went ashore to finally meet the king. After a week of negotiations and under protest, the Hawaiians agreed to his demands. The Hawaiian flag was lowered, and the British Union flag was run up in Honolulu. For the next 5 months, the bewildered Hawaiians would be under British rule. Paulet then appointed himself governor, and the king was effectively reduced to a role of a figurehead. But Paulet's addition of Hawaii to the British Empire had one small problem. The British government had no desire to rule the islands. In fact, at almost the same time, and totally ignorant of what was occurring on the other side of the world, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Aberdeen, was meeting the Hawaiian delegates. He once more outlined Britain's friendship towards Hawaii and respect for their independence. Meanwhile, over in Hawaii, Lord George Paulet was imposing his brand of the British Empire. He ordered all Hawaiian flags destroyed, which was an interesting move, seeing as those flags depicted the Union Jack. He confiscated 3 Hawaiian vessels, repealed missionary-inspired laws forbidding drunkenness, fornication and prostitution, and forced the king to reopen the land cases. He also cleared 156 residents off contested land at the request of Robert Charlton's wife, Betsy. But the Hawaiian king didn't take this change of government lying down. Just 2 days after Paulet's seizure of the islands, his chief minister, Garrett Judd, sent a special envoy, another American by the name of James Marshall, to London to complain to the British government. It took the envoy nearly 4 months to complete the trip, and when he finally arrived in Britain, he found that the previous Hawaiian representatives had, believing their task completed, moved on to lobby the French government in Paris. Urgently summoned by Marshall, they returned to London on the 14th of July and sought a meeting with the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Aberdeen. Horrified by the unilateral actions of a minor, if well-connected, naval officer on the far side of the world, Aberdeen sent an urgent dispatch, or as urgent as communications of the period allowed, to the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet to rein in his subordinate. As it was, at almost exactly the same time, having heard rumours that something strange was happening in the Pacific Kingdom, Admiral Thomas was already sailing to Hawaii to investigate what Captain Paulet was up to. Born in 1777, Richard Dalton Thomas had entered the Royal Navy just before his 13th birthday. He'd fought throughout the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and had taken part in the Battle of Cape St. Vincent aboard HMS Excellent, which was commanded by the then Captain Cuthbert Collingwood. Eventually promoted to Rear Admiral, in May 1841 he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Station and took up the role on his flagship, HMS Dublin. He arrived at Honolulu aboard the Dublin on the 26th of July 1843 and was shocked at what he found. Not only had his subordinate, without any reference to himself, let alone London, seized an independent, friendly nation and added it to the British Empire, But there were now 2 US naval warships in the harbour too. Upon receiving an urgent message from Chief Minister Judd, the US government had dispatched USS Constellation and USS United States. The ageing warships, both veterans of the War of 1812, were no match for the Dublin and HMS Carrisford, but nevertheless they did serve as a message of intent to the British. Despite the fact that the 2 US warships were merely acting as observers, Admiral Thomas was fully aware that the situation could, like many other diplomatic incidents, get out of hand. Well, and thanks to Paulet, they were already, weren't they? Thomas immediately sought a meeting with the King and openly told him that the British government had no interest in ruling Hawaii and that Paulet had massively overstepped his authority. On the 31st of July, he announced that the occupation was formally over and handed back the reins of government to the King. With HMS Dublin, HMS Carrisford and the American naval vessels firing 21-gun salutes, Admiral Thomas handed the King a Hawaiian flag. Interestingly, these were the only sounds of cannon fire in the whole 5-month occupation. And then the Union flag was lowered on what was one of the most bizarre occupations in history. The 31st of July is still celebrated in Hawaii as Laho'i Hoia, or Restoration Day. At the ceremony, the King announced, "The life of the land is perpetuated in righteousness." Those words are now the motto of the state of Hawaii. Admiral Thomas had, unbeknown to and without receiving his orders from London, both restored Hawaiian independence and restored Britain's support for the Kingdom of Hawaii. He had also avoided a potential showdown with the United States, whose missionaries on the islands were in full cry and whose warships were on the scene. As an aside, whilst they were in Hawaii, one of those ships, the USS United States, recruited an American merchant seaman into her crew, a certain Herman Melville, future author of Moby Dick. But that, as they say, is another story. In recognition of his efforts, the King ordered that a portrait of Admiral Thomas in full uniform be placed in his palace, and the place where the exchange of flags took place in downtown Honolulu was named Thomas Square in his honour, and remains so to this day. Eventually promoted to full admiral in 1854, Thomas died in Devon 3 years later, aged 80. Following his actions in Hawaii, Lord George Paulet was quietly shipped back to Britain. However, his naval career did not end in disgrace. In 1850, he was appointed to command HMS Bellerophon in the Mediterranean and would command that ship at the siege of Sevastopol during the Crimean War. He went on to serve as naval aide-de-camp (ADC) to Queen Victoria and eventually attained the rank of full admiral in 1866. He died in November 1879. And what about Richard Charlton, the man who, every bit as much as Paulet, was responsible for the whole affair? Well, he arrived in London only to find that the Hawaiians had beaten him there, and that Lord Aberdeen was not interested in any madcap schemes to add the islands to the British Empire and kick the American missionaries out. Furthermore, the British government refused to even support him in his land claims, stating that they were a matter for the Hawaiian courts. But now it got even worse for Charlton. The Foreign Office dismissed him from his diplomatic position for leaving his post without permission. He ended up selling what land the Hawaiians said he did legally own, and died in Falmouth in his native Cornwall in 1852. In November 1843, the British and French governments signed a joint declaration recognising Hawaiian independence, and 3 years later, the USA did likewise. Hawaii was to remain an independent kingdom for the next 50 years, during which time they established diplomatic legations and consulates in nearly 90 cities around the world. In the end, Hawaiian independence was snuffed out not by the British, or even the French, but by the United States. Precisely 50 years after Paulet's occupation of the island, a coup, organised principally by American citizens, ousted the Queen of Hawaii in 1893. Sailors from a US cruiser stationed in Honolulu were sent ashore to bolster the coup. The ship's name, somewhat ironically, was the USS Boston, a successor to the American vessel in Honolulu when Paulet had arrived all those years before. US President Cleveland ordered an investigation into the role of US citizens and the military in this coup, which concluded that, just like George Paulet, the US naval commander had abused their authority. History does like to repeat itself, doesn't it? Despite the president's desire to restore Hawaiian independence, expansionist supporters in Congress blocked his moves, and eventually, in 1898, the Hawaiian flag was lowered and the Stars and Stripes raised above the islands, as they were formally annexed by the USA. In 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state of the United States, and with its state flag incorporating that British Union flag, it remains so to this day. But for one brief moment in the 1840s, when the Union Jack flew by itself over Hawaii and the Royal Navy had the possibility of developing a naval base at Pearl Harbor, history could have turned out very, very differently. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story, which shows that the British Empire, whilst massive, was never built on a master plan. If you'd like to support my show as a patron, a member, or simply with a one-off donation, please see the links in the description. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.